Hello, thank you for joining us today to discuss the new New Hampshire DOT NEPA Public Involvement Manual. I'm Rebecca Martin. I'm a Senior Environmental Manager with the DOT, and I have with me today Christine Perron from McFarland Johnson. She's a Senior Environmental Analyst there. We both do environmental reviews for transportation projects as our job, so we deal a lot with NEPA and talk about public involvement. Today we're going to provide some background information for you about the NEPA public involvement, tell you how it was developed and why, provide an overview of the contents, and then give you some tips and tricks on how you might use it. So thank you for joining us. I'll mention that I was the task force chairperson for the development of the manual, and Christine was the main author. So why a NEPA public involvement manual? Just as a reminder for everybody, NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, and it's an umbrella regulation. And what I mean when I say that is it's an environmental review that analyzes our impacts on a lot of different resources that are protected by all of these different regulations. So when we think of NEPA and an environmental review, during the DOT project development process, projects are reviewed for which natural, cultural, and socioeconomic resources are in the project area. And then we evaluate what the impacts on those resources might be. And we identify ways to minimize and mitigate those impacts on those resources. For DOT state-funded projects, for those that don't have a federal nexus, like a federal permit or federal funding, we also have a DOT policy that commits us to an environmental review for those state-funded projects that are going through project development. So we have environmental reviews for both our federal and our state-funded projects. NEPA includes outreach requirements. So NEPA guidelines say that there will be early and continuous opportunities for public involvement. And part of that public involvement in the NEPA process is through the environmental review. State projects also have the DOT policy that says that we will have a proactive public involvement process for all of our projects. So for state and federal projects that DOT is doing an environmental review for, there is a public involvement requirement. There's also a requirement that state DOTs have a process in place that is approved by Federal Highway for that public involvement during the environmental review. So the NEPA Public Involvement Manual is that process for DOT, and it has been approved by Federal Highway. So that's how we got here. So how was the NEPA Public Involvement Manual developed? Our Policy and Records Work Group at DOT was advised of the need to have an approved process, and then they authorized the NEPA Public Involvement Manual Task Force. I was appointed as the chair of that task force as part of my Certified Public Manager program, and other members of the task force from the department were selected who have roles at the department with public outreach and are involved in public involvement. We also had some external task force members. So through the Bureau of Environment on-call environmental services contract, McFarland Johnson was tasked with development of the manual. So we were really fortunate to have Christine Perron involved as the author developing the manual for the task force. We also had Jamie Sikora, our Federal Highways Environmental Program Manager, and he was our liaison with Federal Highways headquarters to make sure that we were meeting all of the requirements that we needed to, and he provided a lot of guidance during development of the manual. So using the manual, who do we expect to use it and how? We expect that the primary audience will be project development folks because NEPA, the environmental review, happens during project design, and this manual is targeting public outreach during the environmental review. But we also hope that this manual will be useful for DOT operations and constructions folks, as well as municipalities and consultants. I'll mention that the manual is not meant to be prescriptive. It's a menu of choices and guidance and examples of public outreach that we're hoping people will use and tailor to fit their project. This manual covers public outreach for specific projects, specific DOT projects. It's not looking at the broader transportation planning perspective. That would be handled by the 10-year planning process. So we're talking more about project-specific public involvement here. And over on the right side of the slide, you see a figure from the manual that talks about how you might design the public outreach for your project. So the first thing is to evaluate what your goals are. What are you hoping to get out of that public outreach? Who's your audience? Who are you hoping to reach with it? And then you'll select the methods and the tools that you think are going to best help you reach that audience. You're going to deploy those methods. You're going to test out the tools and see how they work. And then you're going to evaluate what's working well and what isn't, and then go back and maybe tweak the tools you're using or select some different tools. So this figure just reminds us that public involvement for your project should be an iterative process. So you should go back and start over when you need to, and be willing to be flexible and change your plans. We don't have time to go through all of the different contents of the NEPA Public Involvement Manual today, so I just wanted to mention briefly that we do have an introduction that goes through the background. Section 2 goes through the public involvement steps, which I'm going to talk more about. Christine's going to talk to you about virtual public involvement, which is really important now with COVID and everybody having to do things remotely that they're used to doing in person, just like today. We have an appendix that includes different public involvement strategies, best practices, another one that goes through the public involvement regulations because there's other laws that require public involvement. We have an appendix that goes through different DOT policies and manuals. Our initial contact letter template is included in this manual for folks that need to use it. Meeting notices, product examples, and the DOT instructions for Zoom meetings are also included. So I'm going to speak briefly about the steps of public involvement that are detailed in Section 2 of the manual. So for any DOT project that's undergoing an environmental review during the project development process, we are committed to at least one of these bullets that you see here. So we are committed to doing at least one of these things and then more as appropriate for the complexity of the project. So the initial contact letter is the letter that's sent out at the beginning of a project to the public officials in the area that includes some brief ideas about what the project intends to do and asks for their feedback about the resources and any concerns they have for the area. Natural and Cultural Resource Agency coordination meetings that happen at the DOT monthly. Public officials meetings where we go out to the select board and talk about a project and ask for their input. Public informational meetings when we actually get all the folks in the town or in the transportation project area have an opportunity to have their say about what's planned for the project and what the needs of the town are. Electronic notices such as press releases and social media notices, and then as needed public hearings. And the manual describes also that there are different types of public hearings. So a right-of-way public hearing, which would be needed when eminent domain is intended to be used. And then the NEPA public hearing, which is determined, the need for that is determined through coordination with Federal Highway. So for environmental impact studies, so those projects with the highest level of environmental impacts, they're typically needed. And then for environmental assessments and categorical exclusions, that's determined through coordination with Federal Highway. Just a quick note to mention some of those other laws that require outreach during the environmental review, including the DOT Section 4F Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, Wetland and Surface Water Impact Regulations, Civil Rights Act, and Executive Order about environmental justice. And now I'm going to pass the presentation along to Christine, who's going to talk to you more about selecting the appropriate level of public involvement.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca. There are a number of factors to consider when selecting the appropriate level and type of public involvement, including project type and complexity, anticipated impacts to resources, potential right-of-way acquisitions, anticipated public opinion or perception of the project, and NEPA classification. These factors are all summarized in Table 2.1 of the manual, which I'll go over now on the next two slides. Table 2.1 starts by providing examples of different levels of project complexity, with low or no impact projects being those with minimal impacts to resources, traffic, and abutting properties, and being the least complex projects. Moderate impact projects are those that may require minimal right-of-way acquisition, or that may adversely affect historic properties or other resources in the project area. High impact projects are the most complex, involving potentially full property takes, anticipated public controversy, or impacts to significant resources in the area. It's important to note that these categories are just generalized rules of thumb, which are provided to help guide public involvement decisions. I also want to take a moment to discuss NEPA classification. Projects that are classified as having significant impacts or unknown significance of impacts would require an EIS or EA, as Rebecca mentioned, which could require by regulation a formal public involvement plan and a public hearing, as Rebecca also mentioned. Regardless of NEPA classification, projects require early and continuous opportunities for public involvement, and the regulations do not specify a minimum level of public involvement based on the project's NEPA classification. For this reason, NEPA classification cannot be the only factor used to determine the level of necessary public outreach for a project. Most New Hampshire DOT projects these days are categorical exclusions, which, as shown in the rightmost column on the slide, can include high impact projects that warrant a more robust public outreach approach. The next part of Table 2.1 looks at specific project examples that fall under the impact categories shown on the previous slide and identifies the typical level of public involvement that should be considered for the project. The bottom portion of the table illustrates how public involvement strategies should be commensurate with project complexity. Simple signage or striping projects, for example, have little to no impact and warrant minimal public involvement. The public involvement strategies that would be appropriate for these types of projects would be things like simple electronic notices that simply make the public aware that the project will be taking place. It is important, however, to remember that public controversy can also be a measure of project complexity. For example, rumble strip projects have no physical impact outside the footprint of the roadway, but are often met with a great deal of public controversy due to concerns with noise. These projects, therefore, warrant more public involvement than a simple electronic notice. In fact, DOT recently held a virtual public informational meeting for a proposed rumble strip project on New Hampshire Route 106. The two middle columns in the table are where many typical DOT projects fall, in the low to moderate impact range, such as bridge rehab or replacement, shoulder widening, and intersection improvements. These are the projects that generally rely on some or all of the standard DOT public outreach strategies that Rebecca discussed previously, including the initial contact letters, resource agency meetings, and public informational meetings. The rightmost column on the slide shows high impact project examples, such as replacing a historically significant bridge or a major roadway widening. These are the projects that are more likely to require an EA or EIS, but often, as I mentioned earlier, these projects may qualify as categorical exclusions. So regardless of NEPA classification, these are the projects that warrant additional public involvement strategies. That could mean either holding additional public informational meetings, or it could mean using different strategies that I'll summarize in the next few slides. Section 3 of the manual focuses on virtual public involvement, or VPI for short. This section was added when the pandemic made it clear that more guidance was needed for the use of VPI. The Federal Highway Administration defines VPI as the use of digital technology to not only inform the public, but also to engage the public. With the use of digital technology, VPI can increase the number and variety of methods for engaging the public, obtaining feedback on projects, and considering comments. Section 3 provides a summary of a variety of VPI tools and strategies, beginning with FHWA's VPI initiative under Everyday Counts, Round 5, which endorsed the strategies listed here on the slide. I'll provide just a brief overview of what each of these entails. The first VPI tool listed is virtual public meetings. EDC 5 began in 2019, back when virtual public meetings seemed innovative. I think we've all become quite familiar with these meetings over the last year, so I don't need to get into any more detail on these. Mobile apps are tools that most of us use every day, but perhaps not for transportation projects. A mobile application can be developed for a specific project to keep people engaged with and aware of project planning, development, and public involvement opportunities. Project rendering techniques can include photo simulations, 3D images, and virtual reality to demonstrate proposed projects or alternatives. These can be distributed independently on project websites or used to enhance public meetings, either virtual or in-person meetings. Do-it-yourself videos can be an easy, effective way to provide information that's on demand and easily shared on social media or a project website. Simple but effective videos can be created with a smartphone with a basic tripod to describe a project or certain elements of a project. Crowdsourcing is the use of online or mobile tools to assemble ideas, comments, or suggestions about a project by voting for or against them. By voting or appraising an idea, stakeholders can engage during the early stages of a project in a quick, easy, low-stakes way. Mapping tools can be used in a variety of ways, providing interactive capabilities that allow users to search, click, and query a specific project site or area, putting that information into context in a way that's much more difficult through verbal communication. Some tools allow users to share comments or ideas directly on the map. The online mapping tool shown on this slide was recently employed for a New Hampshire DOT project and shows where members of the public have dropped pins to provide feedback on specific locations along the project corridor. All-in-one tools are simply platforms that combine features like crowdsourcing, mapping, renderings, and surveys. North Carolina DOT has used an all-in-one web-based platform for several plans and projects in recent years and has seen an increased participation among all stakeholder demographics. In addition to the Everyday Counts 5 tools, the manual also describes other VPI tools and strategies. Project websites are widely used to compile project information in one location, either on the New Hampshire DOT's project-specific webpage or as a standalone website for larger projects. Electronic surveys can be incorporated into meetings, newsletters, and social media, and provide a low-pressure way for the public to provide input. These surveys can be a powerful way for the project team to gauge public perception about specific components of a project or the overall project to help inform the project's purpose and need and design alternatives. Webinars are similar to do-it-yourself videos mentioned in the previous slide. A webinar can be as simple as recording a PowerPoint presentation and posting that recording on a project website as a way to provide on-demand project information. The pros and cons of specific VPI tools and strategies are included in the manual. In the interest of time, I'll just briefly summarize these in broader terms. So using VPI and a variety of public involvement strategies in general can accelerate the project delivery process. Having a robust public involvement plan helps identify issues early in the project planning process, which typically reduces the need to revisit decisions. VPI provides opportunities to reach audiences and stakeholders that may not normally participate in more traditional in-person meetings. One factor in that is that the use of VPI allows for on-demand access to project information. This allows the public to review and interact with information at their convenience. VPI tools can increase the public's understanding of a project and expand opportunities for sharing and receiving feedback. And finally, many VPI tools offer simple, low-cost strategies when compared to the cost and logistics associated with traditional strategies, such as in-person meetings. It's important to recognize that there are some challenges and potential drawbacks associated with virtual public involvement. Although home computers, high-speed internet, and smartphones have become prevalent throughout society, not all populations utilize or have access to this technology to the same extent. Some of the drawbacks associated with VPI are especially important to consider when creating a fair and equitable public involvement plan that reaches environmental justice, or EJ, populations, such as those with limited English proficiency and low-income populations. We also need to be mindful that elderly populations may not be as proficient with web-based technologies. With all public involvement plans, whether using VPI or not, it's important to offer multiple options for providing input. For example, public outreach materials should provide a phone number for the project manager to ensure that someone who is not able to participate in other ways still has that option to pick up the phone and provide input. When in-person meetings become a more viable option again, using a hybrid approach by offering a virtual option with that meeting would provide more flexibility in attending. In order to understand how to reach all stakeholders, you must first understand the community in and around the project area, which includes identifying all EJ populations. This can be done by using census data and by communicating with local public officials. New Hampshire DOT has an internal process for identifying EJ populations that results in a project memo, which should be distributed to the entire project team to help inform impact analysis and project and public involvement strategies. Once stakeholders have been defined, public involvement strategies and tools should be tailored to reach all populations. There are a number of ways that VPI tools and other outreach can be shared with EJ populations, such as communicating with community leaders about outreach opportunities and providing multi-language materials such as postcards and bulletin boards. For example, a recent outreach event in Nashua provided meeting information in Spanish. And also the New York State DOT actually provides information on their website in multiple languages, including Chinese, using Google Translate. These are both examples of what should be considered when there are EJ populations in the project area. Moving on to the next section of the manual brings us to Appendix A. This appendix provides a summary of alternative public involvement strategies that can be considered by the project team. The appendix provides a menu of options that can be used in any combination to best fit the project and the community needs. Use of public involvement strategies that are not considered standard approaches taken for DOT projects should always be discussed with the New Hampshire DOT Commissioner's Office to ensure that these tools are fully vetted and approved for use. Some of the additional strategies in Appendix A include simple electronic tools such as email distribution lists, use of social media, and project-specific newsletters. There's a section on different types of public meetings, such as listening sessions and workshops, open house type meetings, and walking tours. And finally, there's a section on various options for hard copy materials, such as fact sheets, postcards, and informational brochures. Appendix B of the manual provides a list of best practices to consider when you're preparing for and carrying out public outreach. The list includes tips to consider to help with identifying stakeholders and understanding the community, defining and understanding the project's purpose and need, and identifying the goals of the outreach. There are tips on how to address conflict and how to recognize and honor the diversity of perspectives that will surely be shared as the process develops. There are best practices for preparing and presenting outreach materials and presentations that are compelling, inviting, and easy to understand by a broad audience. Overall, the manual emphasizes the need to be flexible. As more information is shared, outreach strategies may need to be adjusted, as Rebecca already mentioned, and project alternatives may also need to be adjusted.
Thank you, Christine. So you're probably wondering what happens next with this manual now that we have it. So the task force is working on the rollout plan for New Hampshire DOT, which includes developing talking points for the task force members to use as they try to get the word out about the manual and how to use it. A reference sheet that we're going to develop to just point people to the different sections of the manual that they might need to use. A lunch and learn internally for DOT staff, probably pretty similar to what you saw this morning. And also, we're going to use the manual. So we're going to get in the practice of looking at it and selecting tools out of the manual. We're hoping that while people are using the manual, they're also developing their own best practices, and that we'll be able to collect those best practices into future versions of the manual. We are already envisioning a future update of the manual. Federal Highway is currently working on updating their NEPA regulations, and so we'll need to update the manual to reflect those. One thing that's important and noticed throughout the manual is that public involvement leads to a better transportation project. So we're hoping that this manual helps people enhance their public involvement and leads to better transportation projects. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'd be happy to take any questions that you might have